these are the two main links that I visit. So the ASU's Digital Trust Guidelines for Generative Artificial Intelligence Use, and then ASU's Research Security Guidelines for the use of AI in research. I encourage you to bookmark those if you have any studies or you're considering to do studies at ASU with that, because that's exactly what our team will be looking at to see if you've designed it in accordance with the guidelines. Next, you'll want to clarify the overall purpose of the tool and if the tool is meant to drive decisions or inform decisions. So if it's meant to just inform decisions, it's generally just known as a minimal risk. Now, if it's meant to drive decisions and make a diagnosis, that would be a greater risk. The next one here is we want to ensure that the selection of participants is fair, and we also want to have an explanation of the source and characteristics of the data that were used to train the model. So for here, what do I mean by fair selection? What I mean is were potential participants identified based on the scientific goal of the study? Were participants of different ages, sex, or racial backgrounds considered to avoid selection bias? So those are some of the things that you need to think about when you're training your tool. Next, you also want to indicate the type of data that's being analyzed by the tool, and you want to ensure that it aligns with applicable privacy regulations. So for example, I have a link here for the EU AI Act. Really enlightening read. It was just last updated June 2024. And I don't know if you all knew this, but there's different rules depending on the level of risk. So I would encourage you to review that. And also, I included the EU GDPR regulation here as well. Now, as data enthusiasts, I'm curious, how many of you all have heard of Moore's Law, Moore's technological law? Yes, I figured you did there. Yes. So even though, you know, there's debate that Moore's Law says that every 2 years there's a new technology, and that's just the historical trend observed by Intel. And so with that mindset, it's important to keep that in mind with AI. So if there's any new technological advances, you should indicate if it will be updated for those advances. Now moving on to the consent form. So signed consent is always required whenever you're entering data into a novel AI tool. Along with that, you must also consider the regulatory oversight and privacy laws. So as an example, if say your study was sponsored by the FDA, then you would have to ensure that there's certain consent language in there. Or if the GDPR applies, you have to make sure that the participants are provided with the standard consent language as well. Next, you want to provide a clear description of the tool and the specific data that will be collected. So with here, you know, I encourage study teams to get creative, whether they use graphics or they use tables or charts, any way to just make the participant understand, because you want to convey the key information. And I feel that, you know, sometimes information gets lost because we just have paragraphs and it's just like a contract, but I really encourage study teams to be creative in that aspect. You should also include a statement that once the participant's data is uploaded to the tool, there's no way to withdraw the data. And then lastly, like we talked about from the previous slide, Will participants be informed of any technological advances? So will this be communicated to them? Now, you may be wondering if you already have an established AI ML tool, in other words, not a novel tool, and you just want to use it for data analyses. Are there any IRB concerns with this? Well, in your protocol, you must use an approved ASU tool if the intent is for transcription or data analyses. And I went ahead and provided that link there for your review. Common situation that I see this is for interviews that they want to transcribe them. And I always remind them that if it's done through Zoom, Zoom AI Companion is an approved tool if they want to use it. And then also you have to consider the type of conversations that you're having as well. So say if you're doing an interview over Zoom and you're talking about maybe something that's health related or just something sensitive, then it's not recommended to use AI for analyses. And I went ahead and provided that link there. Now for the consent form, kind of see a recurring theme here. Signed consent is required. You must state the specific ASU approved tool that will be used to analyze the participant's data. And lastly, you have to include a statement that there's no way to withdraw the data once it's already there. So what about the other emerging technologies? So we have wearable mobile apps, augmented reality, virtual reality, human-robot interactions. I mean, just from the definitions, they all kind of sounded somewhat of like a variation of a wearable technology, right? So that would mean the protocol and consent considerations are similar. Yes, but not quite the same. So now what I'm going to do for these next few slides here is I'm going to just talk about the unique considerations for these technologies. So with the protocol, clarify the overall purpose of the tool. And if it's a novel tool, clarify that it was pilot tested to collect the proposed measures that the study team is proposing. You want to ensure fair selection of participants while being mindful of the inclusion criteria and avoiding that selection bias. And then here are the crucial ones for each of the wearable technologies. You really want to identify the risk and mitigation measures for these risks. So of course, one of the main concerns here with the wearable technologies and mobile apps is data privacy. And another concern could be physical concern. So for example, like if we go back to the example with the smartwatch, it could cause skin irritation. So the consent form is really that process that's used to mitigate these potential risks. So signed consent is always required. And they should provide a clear description of how the device will be used, as well as the specific data collected. And kind of like I talked about before, you know, consider using a table or some kind of graphic to explain the wearable or app features. And you also want to ensure that you want to provide a device care, instructions, and use and troubleshooting. If it's not a novel tool or app, you'll want to include the privacy policies for the mobile apps or the devices that you're using as well, because this is just to ensure, once again, the participant is able to make an informed decision with key information. And lastly, you'll want to indicate to participants when data collection will stop. So in other words, when do they uninstall an app on their phone? Next, we'll go into AR. So let's look at the protocol here. So clarify the overall purpose of the tool. We got that. Ensure fair selection. Yeah, we talked about that quite a bit. You can kind of see that as a theme here. And then now let's talk about the risk. So since AR collects data from the real world environment, one of the risks is related to data privacy. So there's different biometrics that could be collected when using AR. So you could capture like eye movement, facial recognition, all sorts of these things. And to mitigate for this risk, participants need to be made aware of how to download the AR platform, including proper setup, how to securely remove the platform, what the platform will potentially access on the participant's device. And also, another risk, we want to account for the physical location because this is somewhat of an immersed experience. The participant may not be aware of their surroundings, that they could trip and potentially hurt themselves. So to mitigate for this risk, participants should be monitored at all times. And with the consent form, signed consent is required. Again, kind of like we talked about, giving that a clear description, consider using a table or chart to explain. If it's not a novel tool, include the device's privacy policy. And then you'll have to state the risk again and how these risks will be mitigated. Now, we're going to go into virtual reality. So with respect to the protocol, again, clarify the purpose of the tool. But this time, if you notice, I switched it up a little bit on you. So I want to talk about the potential risk first. So physical risks are contingent on the equipment being used. So a participant could experience something called cyber sickness, which is a whole slew of symptoms where you feel dizzy, lightheaded, drowsiness, fatigued, nausea, and other potential physical risks too could be seizures because of the visual effects, could be tripping or falling because you're completely immersed in this experience, and any contagions from the headset as well. So it's recommended that the study team cleans the devices after each use before the handoff to the next participant. And then, looks like I talked about physical illness and location here. So now if we go on to the next bullet here. So the reason why I put it in this order is because pre-screening is essential when you're doing virtual reality. And what I mean by that is because the screening process, it's for a way to not only include the inclusion criteria, but also any exclusion criteria. So for example, a potential exclusion could be someone with a pre-existing condition. So if they have a history of motion sickness, for example. Another exclusion criteria could be a temporary condition. So for example, if someone's hungover or under the influence of some sort. There should also be consideration of someone's sensitivity to the content of the virtual environment. So say if it's about workplace harassment or gun violence or racial violence, that if anyone is triggered by any of those situations, they should likely not participate. And as I mentioned before, the study team should monitor the participant at all times. They should have a controlled environment of where they do it. So in other words, a setup room if possible. And especially if it's a long immersive experience, there needs to be welfare checks that are done as well, just to ensure that the participant isn't getting any cyber sickness, because sometimes you may not be able to tell because you're just immersed in that. So you're not able to see what's physically going on with you. And for the consent form, again, sign consent, providing a clear description of how the AR tool would be used and what data will be collected. And then how we would mitigate these potential risks. Now for human robot interactions. So this is pretty similar to what we talked about with the wearable and mobile apps. So I'll go ahead and run through this here. So clarify the overall purpose of the tool, and then identify potential risk. So we talked about data privacy as a potential risk. So I won't go into that because it's the same as it is for the wearables and mobile apps. But I want to touch on a little bit the social and emotional risk. So something that study team should be aware of when humans are interacting with robots, they could form relationships with these robots. You know, they could treat them like real people. So that should be something that could be taken into account if they end up, you know, forming a bond with this bot. They don't want to part with the bot. And also usability risk as well. So you want to ensure that the participant is well trained in how to use the robotic, just so they don't injure themselves or anything. And again, that's why the pre-screening is essential for this process as well, especially for that second risk there, the social and emotional risk. If there's any type of psychological history, you know, that would hinder the participant with interacting with the robot, then it's best that they're excluded. Now, the consent form. Again, signed consent is required. Provide a clear description of the proposed tool that will be used and specific data. And then state the potential risk and how these risks will be mitigated. So I want to thank you for enduring this with me. We're finally coming to the close of the presentation where we put all the pieces together. So consolidate. So I know we covered a lot of ground here. We talked about who the ASU IRB is. We talked about research with human subjects. We identified the emerging technologies and the protocol and consent form considerations for these technologies. But if you look closely enough and just pause, there's actually 4 emerging themes, that ethical themes that come from these emerging technologies. So first, we have reliability. The purpose of the emerging technology and its intended use should be made clear to the participants. We should be able to rely on the study team that what they say the tool's intended use is the actual intended use. Then we have fair selection, using scientific rationale to target the population of interest and avoiding selection bias. The third theme here is transparency. So be transparent in terms of the type of data you're going to collect and the type of data sets that were used to train the model, for example, if this is relation to an AI tool. And lastly, the final piece of the puzzle here is governance. And governance, by that, I'm referring to the policies and regulations and ethical guidelines for the deployment of these emerging technologies. It ensures safety, fairness, and respect for human rights in research and in application. So this is the end of my presentation. I have my email address up there. If you'd like to, network and collaborate and chat, I'm more than open to do so. If you have any general ASU IRB inquiries, you could email our inbox there. And I also had just a quick survey. I would really appreciate the feedback because this is my first conference that I've ever spoken at. So this is a milestone for me and professional development. So it would be really helpful if you could do that. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. I'll be around for any questions. Thank you. Yes. 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 So yeah, if it's someone who's passed away, then doesn't require IRB review.
Great question. Having read quite a few, not done myself, but they're pretty clear about what you can do. Whereas the third party tools and pilot policies and conditions can be very long and confusing. So how do you match those two? Like if you are using a third party here and you're researching from a third party, you are very well involved.
So that's a great question. And, that's something that the team is working towards. So we're working in conjunction with RTO right now to kind of evaluate this on a case-by-case basis, because I'll tell you what, when I'm reviewing a study and I see that it's a particular device and I see it's an app, I look at the privacy policies and I ask the study team, were you aware of this? Or were you aware of that? So I think the short answer is we're working towards it. And by working towards it, we're saying, include privacy policies within the consent form. The participants should review it, but it's still a work in progress. I think there still needs to be work done there to close the knowledge gap. Hi.
Really good, really great.
Thank you.
In terms of the future of IRBs, the process and the regulation about it, a lot of the, globally, a lot of the regulation is going towards giving the user more control of their data, more ownership against their data. And when I'm listening to your consent forms, it sounds like a very black and white, like you signed away, and then once you signed off, it's basically giving up the access to your data. Is that going to change in the future? You see a future where the user will have more control over where their data is being shared?
Yeah, I know that there's forums that's being discussed, and I know the FDA is going to issue some regulatory guidance, especially with respect to AI and ML and users' data protection rights. So we'll see that in the future, but we don't really have anything concrete yet. It's really just relying on ethical principles and trying to best protect the participants the way we can.